Welcome back to another one of your Flip Lectures. Today we're going to talk about early U.S. politics and the first political parties in the United States. Now, George Washington, after serving 2 4-year terms as president, decided that 2 terms was enough for any one president. And so he delivered a farewell address after declining to run for a 3rd term as president. And in his farewell address, he warned the country against forming political parties, having trouble with sectionalism, like North versus South or East versus West, and also foreign alliances with other countries. The irony of this, the U.S. is going to get involved in all of these, and some problems are going to result. And so the first American political parties are formed pretty immediately after George Washington is going to leave office. And the first political party is going to be known as the Federalists. Now, these are not the Federalists of the Federalist versus the Anti-Federalist debate. It's an entirely new political party, but it is going to be led by Alexander Hamilton. And the Federalists are going to pretty much represent the North. And they're going to believe that the national government should be supreme over the state governments. They're going to want to put ruling power in the hands of the wealthy and the educated. They want an economy based on manufacturing and the Industrial Revolution that's taking place around the world. They believe that the Constitution should be interpreted loosely. That is, that they can imply powers of the federal government in order for the federal government to do more things in regulating the country. Also, they're in favor of tariffs and trade because they believe that 1, they protect industry, and 2, it's a good way to raise revenue for the U.S. government. And in terms of European alliances, the Federalists are going to back Great Britain as their kind of favorite country to have trade and alliances with. And on the other hand, is going to be a new political party known as the Democratic Republicans, often just called Republicans. And their leader is going to be Thomas Jefferson. You may remember the Hamilton-Jefferson debates. Well, those debates are going to turn into kind of America's first political party. The Democratic Republicans are going to primarily represent the southern and the western states. They're going to believe that state governments should be supreme over federal, that the ruling power should be landowners, not necessarily just the wealthy or the educated, but all people who owned land. They're going to favor an agricultural economy, believing that land makes people independent, able to kind of do things for themselves. They believe that the federal government should be interpreted strictly under the Constitution, that the enumerated powers, those written in the Constitution, should be the only powers that the federal government has. They're against tariffs because, again, tariffs hurt farmers who rely on trade with Europe to make their money. And then finally, in European affairs, Democratic Republicans are going to favor France. So as you can see, these 2 political parties don't really have common ground on anything. And so the first presidential election after George Washington is going to be the election of 1796. And the Federalist Party runs John Adams of Massachusetts, who was also the first vice president. And the Democratic Republicans choose to run Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. And in an extremely close vote, and as you can see, it was pretty much along a lot of north-south lines, Adams is going to win by a vote in the Electoral College of 71 to 68. And during Adams's presidency, the United States fights an undeclared war with France over a couple of issues. They're going to call this the Quasi-War, and more to come on that later. But for now, just understand that the United States is involved kind of in wars between France and Great Britain, but only kind of moderately. And so using the Quasi-War as an excuse, the first Federalist government is going to pass a series of very unpopular laws. And John Adams is going to support all of these. These laws are known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. And their logic is that the United States needed more national security because they were involved in this undeclared war with France. But ultimately, kind of what these acts, the Alien Acts, kind of dealing with immigrants, are going to be aimed at Irish and French immigrants who actually usually voted against the Federalist Democratic Republicans, making it very controversial. It's going to allow for the government to deport these people without a trial or hearing. And so this is going to be very, very unpopular among the Democratic Republicans and among many Americans who feel that depriving immigrants of kind of their residency without trial was unfair and the kind of stuff that Great Britain would do. The Sedition Act made it a crime to publicly criticize the federal government. If you guys remember the Constitution, freedom of speech pretty much guarantees your right to criticize the federal government. And so the Federalists and Adams are going to become wildly unpopular because the fears of people who feared a central government seemed to all be coming true just shortly after George Washington left office. Now, other controversies under Adams's reign were the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And Virginia and Kentucky passed these resolutions that said that states could declare laws unconstitutional. And so Virginia and Kentucky basically said, we believe the Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional, and so they said that they would not follow them. That's called nullification. And remember that sovereignty question that was never really settled? Well, it comes up almost immediately. And we're going to talk about nullification again as this story kind of starts moving forward. And so Adams is very unpopular, and he has to run for re-election again in 1800. The election of 1800 is going to be a particularly brutal election in which basically John Adams will call Thomas Jefferson an atheist and say that the grand question that people have to vote is either for God and a religious president or for Jefferson and no God. Or on the other side, Jefferson said that Adams was essentially selling out the country to create a new Great Britain. And so a very brutal election on all sides created kind of a very interesting situation. And the election of 1800 is one of the more interesting elections that's ever taken place in U.S. history. And so we're going to take a closer look at that using a reading. But the result of the election is that basically Thomas Jefferson is going to win out against the unpopular Federalists and especially the unpopular President John Adams. And so when Jefferson takes over in 1800, he's immediately going to shift the way that Americans do politics. The Democratic-Republican Party, led by Jefferson, tried to reinstate the spirit of '76, that is limiting the size and the power of the federal government. They are going to take some steps against the National Bank. They're going to end the whiskey tax to pay the debt. They're going to cut the size of the army in favor of state militias, and they're essentially going to try to shrink the power of the federal government as much as possible. Jefferson's ideal America is one in which all Americans would be common folk, farmers owning land. And so his policies are going to try to favor that idea of an America where everyone can be small landowners. He's also going to favor Western expansion, because if everyone's going to own land, then you're going to need more land in order to put all those people there. And so his presidency is also characterized by a distrust of bankers, merchants, and industry, which the Federalists, George Washington, and then John Adams have been very friendly to. But remember the core of this debate between Jefferson and Hamilton, and it makes sense that when Jefferson got in, he would do all the policy, he would kind of fix all the policies that he had opposed. And it's during Jefferson's presidency that Aaron Burr, who was actually the sitting vice president, dueled Alexander Hamilton over political and personal disputes. It's an interesting story, and I encourage you guys to read more. But in 1804, the vice president of the United States killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, which kind of shows just how personal and just how kind of harsh these political disputes were. And so in 1800, like we talked about, the United States capital moved from New York City into what is now called Washington, D.C. They created the District of Columbia, a new capital, and that is where Thomas Jefferson spent out his days as president. And after Thomas Jefferson served his 2 terms in office, he chose not to run for a 3rd term. This is going to be following in the precedent of George Washington, that if Washington didn't have more than 2 terms, then who else could really ask for more? And so James Madison, the father of the Constitution, is finally going to be elected president of that federal government in 1809. And he is going to continue the Virginia dynasty of Democratic Republicans. He wins very easily, but most of his presidency is going to be wrapped up in various international conflicts like the War of 1812. But again, we're going to talk about those